Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton. And this week, we're going to get into a topic that fits right in with the theme this week, Valentine's Day, and in particular, rekindling. So we know from a lot of studies that relationships are what make us happy. And so long-term relationships generally lead to happiness, but sometimes they can grow stale. And so tonight we're going to primarily talk about why that happens and what you can do about it and why it matters as well. I think that's one of the things that we often focus on in this podcast is why does it even matter? Why are we even talking about this? So we're going to start out by talking about how sexuality changes over the course of a relationship. And I'll just get it out of the way right now. The biggest change is going to come when you have kids.
I agree. I agree with that
Yes.
because I was thinking about what are the reasons that relationships go stale, and I mean there are multiple reasons certainly, but one of them is children. I mean, if you think about it, that first year, I think it's so hard. I still remember being so tired, and I know Lindy was more tired than I was, and I really don't have any right to complain about that. But I just remember being tired, and you're always taking care of this little child who needs your care in order to survive. You're changing diapers, you're feeding. It becomes all consuming. And I think you mentioned this a couple of episodes ago, that when you're constantly being touched and grabbed at, and I think when, if you're nursing, you've got this baby attached to you, probably
literally
you wanted somebody else to be attached to you in that way as well. And so I think that you're right over time. So there's that. As the marriage progresses, if you have children, then your focus is on the children. And it's hard to remember that you really need to focus on each other at times. I mean, you can't just ignore the children, but you have to really make the relationship a priority. I think the other thing is hormonal. We've talked about before how I think in the early stages of the marriage, the hormones are such that you're going to be a lot more sexually active. And I mean, one of the reasons for that is, which I think is kind of cool, it's nature's way to get us to hook up and procreate and have children. So then you have children and boom, that's it. No more sex. And that's an extreme thing. But, because you've actually completed your evolutionary task right there.
Yes.
Procreated. So there's no reason for it. So your hormones set, the desire tends to change. But so you're in a committed relationship, you've got these children. I think the other, I'll call it boredom. And I've heard people use that word. I think it's we talked before about how our brain loves novel experiences. And so what happens is you're going along, your life, day to day becomes a lot the same. Especially when you have those young children. You get up, they go to bed, you get them to school, they come home, you do homework, you clean up, and you do it all over again. It's hard to remember to focus on the relationship. So I think those are, a couple of different reasons why that happens and why sexuality then starts to change. It's not novel anymore. And so sometimes people get bored. I think there's even more to it than that, though, that you become tired. And I think that being tired is really a desire killer. You have to, I think it's very hard, when you're tired to even think about, okay, let's, get together and be sexual. So I think there are multiple reasons why the sexuality starts to wane.
Right. And I think another one could be what we talked about last week is your emotional intimacy has dissipated. And when that dissipates, the physical intimacy, your sexuality it's going to follow.
Right. I had a couple first-time session yesterday, and I always ask them, so if the issue is less emotional connection, less sexuality, I want to know what it was like at the start of the marriage. And you actually want them to go back and to be able to remember what it was like And Gottman in his research also says that the way a couple tells the story of how they met and got together is a really good indicator of the potential success. So if they talk about their meeting story and getting together in the first few years of their marriage and they brighten a bit, that's a really good sign. If they can't remember what the reasons are, or they can't remember what their sexuality was like, that's not a very good sign.
Yeah,
And
it's a sign of trouble.
right, right. And so, most couples have what they would say is a good emotional connection. Now, I think in the early days of the marriage, both men and women can mistake a very strong sexual connection with a good emotional connection.
Okay.
And so one of the things that then, changes is if you start to have less sex, for instance, because you have children, then it's going to be more likely that the female, again, is generalization, not always true for every female, but it's going to be likely that the female feels emotionally disconnected. And when they feel emotionally disconnected, they typically don't want to be physically intimate with their partner. Now, the thing with a lot of men is that what their wives don't understand, they're sensing, oh, my husband just wants sex. And it almost takes on the negative meaning. But what they don't understand is, and I think this is true in long-term relationships, when men want to have sex, that's the only way they know how to become emotionally intimate. Because after, you're together and you each have an orgasm and the man feels emotionally connected.
Yep.
And so, yes, he wants the physical connection and release. That's true. But what he's getting at the end is emotion. He's getting that emotional connection. And so to help the spouse learn that what he's really wanting is emotional connection, this is the only way he knows how to do it. Let's work on, helping you figure out how to increase your emotional connection.
And we do know that there are hormones that are released during orgasm.
Oxytocin.
And yes, oxytocin. And that's important to know because it's a bonding agent. And so, that's one of the powers of sexuality is, those hormones, when they're released, they bond you together. And so there is an emotional connection that does happen there. And so, and I don't want to mitigate that because it's important, but it's harder to get there. And it's especially harder for a woman to achieve climax if her head's somewhere else, right? Or if she doesn't have that emotional security, or she doesn't have that emotional intimacy to lead up to that physical intimacy.
Right. And you're saying if her head's somewhere else, I hear that often, is that the wife, again, this shouldn't be the case, but it's often the case, feels responsible for, say, keeping the house, in order and getting the kids to bed. And what the husband doesn't realize is that if he would help more, and if he would take half the burden, then her head isn't there. Because often what I hear is the work is never done, which is true when you have a family. I mean, there's always wash to do, there's always something to clean, there's always a kid to take care of. And so if you are both equally involved in the care of the children and the house, then much more likely the woman is going to be able to let go of that and her head won't be somewhere else.
Yep, exactly. So there's this book that we've talked about before, and I never referenced it because I couldn't bring myself to look it up. It's called Porn for Women.
Oh, I have that book in my office.
Okay,
have I told you that?
I think so. So you can send me the title and the author because I can't bring myself to Google it because I don't want porn. Like, I don't want actual porn. So
I have that in my office. I'll describe it for our listeners.
Yes.
It's not one author. So it's called Porn for Women. It's a small little book. I think it's by the Cambridge Women's Group or something. So the whole premise, admittedly, I showed it to a guy the other week, and all the men in there have six-pack abs and things like that.
Okay,
which isn't an accurate portrayal of most men. But if you go beyond that, for instance, like often there's a difference in the temperature in the home. This is really simple. Like often the female wants it warmer, the male wants it cooler. And so it's just all it is. It's got a picture of this guy, and there's never a picture of a woman in there. The picture of the guy, and you can tell he's talking to his partner, and all he's saying is, "What would you like the temperature at, dear?" And so
Mhm.
that's the whole premise. It's about cleaning. There's a picture of him vacuuming. It's this whole thing. And so what it is, when they're saying porn for women, it's what really will turn women on
Yes.
is their partners doing these things for them. There's this whole sports analogy. Oh, I don't want to watch the game, dear. Would you like to watch the ballet with me?
Yep.
That thing. So
Doing the dishes, vacuuming, turn-ons for women.
right. And so I always thought it was pretty funny, and most people laugh when they see
Yeah.
it. But the name throws a lot of people off because I hand them this small little book and it says porn for women, and they go, "Oh wait, I
I
don't
don't know. I don't want. Yeah.
want."
Well, and that's exactly why I don't want to Google it, because I know I'm going to get actual porn and I don't want that's not what I'm looking.
Oh, that's a good point. If you go on to Amazon, I think you'll probably be less likely. Only
Okay.
Google on Amazon, you'll probably find it. And
Y-
it's small, if it's even still in print. I've had that book for a very long time.
Yes.
Years.
Well, and if you start with the author, then you're
Well,
also less likely, because I mean that's why I just couldn't bring myself to do it, because I didn't want to deal with the search results.
let me just take a second.
Okay.
You can.
Mark's gonna Google it for
I'm
us.
gonna Google. I'm gonna find out.
What happens when you Google this book.
Oh,
I mean, it's
I don't care about that. See,
right.
once you hit my age, you don't care what it. Who
Or
cares?
nah, that doesn't faze me. I don't care. I mean, and I guess if you're seeing other men, maybe it's different. But I mean, just me personally, you know.
Well, I won't do it. It's going to take me too long. I don't want to
Okay.
spend the time, but it's really an amusing book. But it really makes sense to women. Okay,
It
that's
does.
like women will look at it, and I'll give it to the couple,
Hmm.
and the woman's shaking her head. Well, yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yeah, all of that stuff. And so I don't think we realize as men that I've said this before. I hope I don't offend some of our male listeners. We still live in a male dominated world.
Hmm.
Even though I think things are better than they were, say, in the 50s,
Yes.
it's still not equal. I mean, I think it would be very hard pressed to say there's equality between the sexes. I just don't see how that's true. And even, within the home, I think that men do more now. It's not at all close to 50%.
Right.
That it's not that way. We know that the women in a home with a family by far do the most care of the home and the kids. And
Hmm.
so I think that if men up their game, so as we're talking about rekindling, I really hadn't thought about it in this context, but I think this is a really good way to think about it. That's one of the best ways for you to rekindle the relationship from the man to
Yep.
do, to up their game about what's going on around the house and be what I hear. Here's the other word that I hear often from the wives. They're saying it's like he doesn't notice.
Right.
I believe that. I think it's true that we notice different things, but again, that's just a learned skill. And
Hmm.
so I try and help the husbands understand when you walk into a room and you have a family, notice what needs to be done.
Yes.
Don't just walk through the room. The words I hear used, be present. Be
Right.
present in the room. Look, what's going on? What
Hmm.
do I need to do? What needs to be put away? And so I think if you do that, then get that book, Born for Women, and do the things in there,
Hmm.
that's going to rekindle your relationship
Yeah.
because it's going to show your spouse that you really do care. And it's going to free up that, as you said, her head is somewhere else.
Hmm.
It's going to free up that space in the spouse's head to be more focused on the relationship.
And I've heard it described once before as the reason why women don't want to just tell men what to do all the time. It's because they want them to use their knowledge and their skills. I mean, especially if you are a college educated man and you have a business degree, don't tell me that you can't figure out how to help run a household.
You have to be able to figure out. But also, what it does, if the woman's always telling the man what to do, it puts her in the role of mother,
Yeah. Yep.
which never works. And so I think that you have to be a team. I use
Hmm.
that word a lot on this podcast, that I think couples they need to be a sexual team, they need to be a financial team, they need to be a parenting team. And so, around the household, taking care of a house, you need to be a team. Now, that
Yeah.
doesn't mean you're going to have different tasks,
Right.
which is fine. You don't need to always be doing the same task, but you have to be able to agree that you're a team and you're doing, fairly equal stuff. It's never going to be totally equal, and you shouldn't look
Hmm.
for it to be that way, but we can sure do a better job of getting closer
Right.
to equality.
And one thing that I want to point out is, if a man decides that he wants to start doing this, wants to start being more present and being more involved, I think that women need to expect that and understand that it's going to be a process,
Yes,
that it's not just going to happen overnight.
right.
So, and I think the first thing that you need to do is you need to talk to them and say, hey, I would like for you to do this for me. I would like you to pay more attention to what needs done around the house. And to start out with, you're probably going to have to tell him a lot of what you need him to do.
Right, but you have to be careful. So this is what I see often is the wife will criticize the man for the way he's doing.
Mm.
That
Oh,
will
yes.
kill this process uh,
Yes.
so fast. And so you can't criticize what he's doing. And
Right.
you have to figure out a different way to, like, if things need to be done or you want them done a certain way, either you have to give up on that or you have to find a different way
Yes.
to help him learn how to do that. But criticism, it will just shut this whole thing down.
That's a good point. And so now, if there are certain things, like for many, many years, I was the only one that would do the laundry because Curtis didn't do it right. And I was okay with it. It was fine. It didn't bother me that I had to do the laundry because he didn't do it right. I mean, but right, so I think you need to be explicit, and you need to accept that, and you need to be okay with, if you really want something done a certain way, you need to be the one to do it yourself. And I also think that it's important to recognize that, what, they are doing something. Maybe they didn't do it exactly the way you wanted it. It's okay. I promise you, 15 years from now, you are not going to be concerned about the fact that he put the dishes away wrong. Like,
Right.
it's not going to be
The
that big
way
of a
you load
deal.
the dishwasher would
Yes.
not be an issue. I can tell you, I still remember this. We spent at least half a session talking about the direction the towels should be put in the linen closet.
Yes.
That was an issue. You've got to give up on some of these things that don't matter. And I really think that when couples do that, because you've got to do that with kids, because when
Hmm.
kids become adolescents, you've got to choose your battles. And so I think
Yes.
that's true for adults as well. Anyway,
Right.
getting back to rekindling, last week we mentioned briefly about, and we've talked before, we like novel experiences. Our brain likes
Hmm.
novel experiences. And so I think one of the I think there are a couple of things that you need to do. You need to have time together, which we talked about last week as well. But you can't rekindle the marriage without spending time together.
Yeah.
One of the things that you can do is have new experiences together. Now, if you talk about sexuality, it can be difficult to figure out what do you do differently.
Hmm.
And so, being creative, if as long as you're in you both agreed you're in a monogamous relationship, then I think the first task is to be comfortable talking about sex.
Yes.
And for whatever reason, so many couples are not comfortable talking about sex.
I
And
think
I
it stems from family of origin, about the
probably, or culture too.
yeah, I mean, because, sex is not, it's just not talked about. And
Right.
also, and I think a lot of that stems from the fact of that other extreme of, there's so much sex in everything today that
Right.
it doesn't feel special. And so I
Right.
think, in a way, couples, or at least maybe in particular my parents' generation, they want to hold on to that idea that, sex is special and it's just between us, it's private. And, I don't want it out there in the world. I don't want everybody knowing all of these details about my sex life. And you're right, they shouldn't. But, I think we need to find a way to appropriately talk about it in the context of our home. Sex is important to talk about, and you need to be talking about it.
Right. So we're not suggesting anybody talk about sex with anyone else. It's just
Yes.
couples themselves
Hmm.
are somewhat uncomfortable. And here's what I think it is that what turns us on is pretty unique to us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of shame. There can be a lot of shame attached to sexuality. So, good sexuality, I think you need to be vulnerable. I mean,
Yeah.
you're lying there naked together, but it's not just being physically vulnerable, it's being emotionally vulnerable. That if you are talking about what it is that you want to do or what it is that turns you on, you have to realize that's an incredibly emotionally vulnerable thing to do. And also realize you aren't going to say these things to anybody else in the world.
Yes.
And so you have to feel safe. And again, it's this process. If there's judgment, it'll kill the process.
Yeah.
Like if someone says, well, I really, want to try this or this might feel good. And the other person says, well, that's weird. Yeah, right. Which is a
Yep.
judgment.
Yep.
It'll shut it down and that person won't talk about it again.
Yeah.
You're already being vulnerable by bringing this out. And so the best thing you can do is to really listen and understand. It goes back to listen, understand the validation and the
Yep.
empathy. You may not agree with it, but you've got to be able to hear it and validate and understand it. That doesn't mean that, I mean, who knows what the solution or what it is you're going to do differently, if anything,
Mm-hmm.
but you've got to be able to have the conversation because that is emotional intimacy, which is helping your sexual intimacy.
So, real quick, Mark, I want to bring up something that I think is going to be important here when you're talking about, maybe wants, desires, and preferences is,
Mhm.
don't criticize or don't say, well, that's weird. But I mean, be open to the idea of them maybe not liking that idea. And again, remembering that you don't marry
Right.
yourself, you actually marry someone else, as you said before. And so I think if your spouse presents something and you're uncomfortable with it, you need to be okay saying that makes me uncomfortable, and you need to be okay hearing that. And remember, just because they say they're uncomfortable with it doesn't mean it's a rejection.
Right.
It just
It's just
means,
they're just uncomfortable. Yeah.
yeah,
I
I
agree.
think that's important to because it can be hard to say, it can feel like rejection for your
Right.
partner to say, I'm uncomfortable with that. So just be prepared for that and be open to that idea.
So the next thing I'm going to say, hopefully I can do this without taking a lot of time because this can be complex. So most everyone, I think I can say that confidently, most everyone has sexual fantasies.
Hmm.
And one of the most intimate emotionally things you can do is to be vulnerable enough to share those fantasies with your
Okay.
partner.
Hmm.
And so your largest sex organ is, people can't see me, I'm pointing to my head.
Your brain.
It's your brain. And so if you think about children growing up, the fantasy world is a way they can become the prince or they can go off and be the cowboy on the horse. And fantasy is really important for our brains. And so there are all these things I want to make clear. Fantasy is fantasy. I am not talking at all about living out your fantasies. Okay.
Hmm.
That is not what I'm talking about. I hope listeners understand that. Once you cross over into actually doing these fantasies, then it's not fantasy anymore. It's real life, and that doesn't work.
Okay.
So the fantasy is totally in your head.
Hmm.
Now, the reason this is hard for couples is one or both of you can be jealous of
Mm.
just that this thing's going on in your head. But I think if you realize that having the fantasies is normal for most people. I'll mention this book. The woman, her name's Nancy Friday. This is way old. I mean, it's probably 20 years or more older. She was the first one that I know of who compiled a book. It's called My Secret Garden, and it was all about female fantasies, female
Okay.
sexual fantasies. And she ended up writing 3 or 4 books. And then I think there's one she started compiling male fantasies as well. But it was the first time that I know of that someone actually put it down and started to normalize it.
Okay.
So if you're thinking about novel experiences, and you're in a monogamous committed couple, you aren't going to go out and be wild. I mean, that's damaging to the relationship.
Right.
So you have to be careful if you do this. I would, if I ever talk to couples, and it's not, I don't talk to every couple about this because the couple has to be in the right frame of mind. They have to be willing to, one, not be jealous
Hmm.
and realize that it doesn't mean the person doesn't love you in the same way or doesn't want to have sex with you. It's just that they've got this brain up here that, I mean, it's natural for it to think about that fantasies. So you can either keep it inside
Mm-hmm.
or you can share it with the other person, which then increases your novelty and it's intimate, it's emotional. You have to be really vulnerable. But again, you have to be safe. You
Right.
can't, like if someone says, oh, here, this is my fantasy, and you're talking about it, and the other person criticizes it or said, oh, that's dumb or that's weird, it'll shut it down.
Right.
You'll do more damage.
Yes.
That's my worry, is that the couple people who are listening to this,
Mm-hmm.
and if they're thinking, oh, I might try this, you have to set some ground rules for this. No
Okay.
criticism. Fantasy does not become reality
Mm-hmm.
ever,
Mm-hmm.
because then it's not fantasy. And you have to be open to hearing the other person. It doesn't mean they don't love you.
Right.
What's going on in their brain. Now, I don't know. I don't think you and I have ever even talked about that. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
So I'm wondering what the difference is between fantasy and role play.
I don't think there is any, but I think the
Okay.
role play. So the role play is, I think, just a variation on the fantasy.
Okay. So I mean, and do you see anything wrong with that if couples want to pretend to
No,
engage in role? Okay. So
no, no, I don't. As long as, and again, I think we've talked about how, people might want to invite another partner. That might be a fantasy. That's fine to have it to be a fantasy. It just doesn't work in real life. And so
right.
that's a role. You can't role play that. You can talk about it and you can
Mm-hmm.
fantasize about it together, but you never do it.
Right.
So I think I see role play as different than that.
Okay.
It's not making it reality, that it is a fantasy.
Yeah. And so I think also that, fantasies, and what sounds like what you're talking about is if it can be very uncomfortable if that fantasy involves another person.
Right.
Now,
Yes.
that,
That's a pretty natural fantasy for both men and women.
right. And so, but it doesn't necessarily have to. So I
No.
think one thing that you can do if you want to increase your emotional intimacy or just a novel experience is write out how you want a sexual experience to go. Write
Yeah.
it out on just, take out a piece of paper and and it could be between the two of you,
Hmm.
and if you're worried about someone finding it because, that is very private and very personal, burn
Yeah.
it afterward.
You don't want your kids to find that later on
No.
after you've died and the kids go, oh, okay, this is interesting.
Until it wasn't,
Right.
right? And that could be a really good way to express your fantasy is to
Yeah.
write it out, I mean, and then just being open to trying new
New thing.
things, right?
Yeah. And I think now a lot of people can't afford to do this. I realize when I say, take a vacation to Mexico,
Right.
that's out of the reach of a lot of people. But I think I'm using it as an example that if the couple, they've been married, they have kids, they haven't gotten away, you take off and you go a weekend or a week somewhere, just being out of the house and being out of that regular context typically is going to increase your desire to be sexual with your
Yeah.
partner. You're in a new location, you're in a new place, and so just being somewhere different is often, that would be a novel experience. But I really want to reiterate this, that I think it can be helpful for a lot of couples. I think you have to be really careful with this and, no judgment, no criticism, be vulnerable and realize it's just in this person's head.
Yeah.
It's not reality. It's just in their head.
And it's not what they actually want. I think that's another important distinction to make. Just because they
Right.
have this
Right.
fantasy, it doesn't
Right.
mean that this is
Like
what
I
they
really want this. That's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. That it doesn't mean that. I often use the word erotic, and a lot of people are uncomfortable with that word. But I think that in the context of a committed relationship, it's a good word to use because
Mhm.
what we find erotic is different
Yeah.
to each one of us. And so I think what's going on in your brain when you have those fantasies, it's just a way to feel that eroticism. And
Mhm.
so it's not what you want. You can have the
Yep.
fantasy and in your mind think, I would never do that, which is
Yeah.
which I think is true for most people. I would
Yeah.
never. In fact, I think that's probably one of the definitions of fantasy is that when you can say, yeah, this is interesting to think about, I would never do that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yes. So,
Well, I really want listeners to be careful about it. You can think
yeah.
about it. You can talk to your partner about it, talk about it before you launch into it, and talk
Mhm.
about the pros and cons of it. I think the books, again, My Secret Garden by Nancy Friday was the first one on female fantasies. I think that could be a good way to start. There are also some podcasts that I want to mention. Won't talk about them other than just to mention them. I think you're going to put these in the program notes. So the first one, Secret to a Good Relationship, is the name of the podcast. It's Andrew Huberman and a guy named Lex Friedman. Then the other one is The Science of Love, Desire, and Attachment, podcast by Andrew Huberman. Now, I've mentioned Andrew Huberman before. What listeners have to be aware of is these podcasts are really long,
Okay.
like 2.5 hours long. It's hard to listen to it all at once. And he is a neurologist, and he's going to talk about the science. That might be boring to a lot of people. If you're interested in what's going on in the brain, he's going to talk about that. What's going on in the brain with love, desire, and attachment. And so for a lot of people, I think that can be helpful. And then there's a book. I haven't read this book, but I found this. It's called Can Love Last by Stephen Mitchell.
Okay.
And so I think that can be helpful too, reading about what are the ideas that other people have as far as rekindling the relationship. But I think the takeaway from this, I hope for the listeners, is you've got to take time. You cannot do this unless you're spending time with your partner. If you don't, if you don't decrease the stress. So stress is another thing I've mentioned before. Stress gets in the way of having healthy relationships. And I would guess 90% or more of the couples that I see have some sort of stress in their lives that makes it difficult. It's mostly work stress is where it comes from, but it makes it difficult for them to connect with the other person. So you've got to decrease your stress, and you've got to spend time together. And then you have to talk about, come up with a plan. What are we going to do either to rekindle our sexuality or rekindle our emotional connection? Come up with a plan together and have some steps and make it concrete, and then follow it and do it. And I strongly suggest do it on a weekly basis.
Right. And so I think, or like we've talked about, is the first step is to reconnect emotionally.
Yes.
So get that emotional intimacy. Once you've established that, I think one of the important things about going away or getting together, just the two of you, is because you're stepping into a role of just a couple.
Yes.
Stress is completely unavoidable. It is just a fact of life. So if you can plan a weekend away, and it doesn't have to be elaborate. I mean, it can be, an hour drive at an Airbnb somewhere. But the point is
It
that
could be camping. A lot of couples, people like to camp. I don't like to camp, but a lot of people do go camping as a couple. It's going to be a very different experience than camping with your kid.
Yes. And so, because the point is, I mean, when you're at home, you have so many different roles. I mean, you've got the role of mother, or you've got the role of father, you've got career, right? You've got all these different roles. But when you go away as a couple, you're putting all of those other roles aside, and you're stepping into that role of spouse.
Yes.
And that's going to force you to focus on the relationship.
Right. And so when you do go away, make sure that's why camping is not a bad idea, because often you don't have cell service.
Yes.
You can't use your phone. And so you need to, disconnect, which we could do a whole episode on the importance of disconnecting, but you have to disconnect on a regular basis, I think, from your electronics. And so going away with your partner, disconnecting, I agree with you. That's your role, is your partners or spouses. And so that's what you focus on.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah. All right. So next week we're going to, I guess you could call it another continuation.
We've got a theme going, but I think it's probably because of Valentine's.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about what is romance, and
which is different for every person, just so we,
Well, okay, I guess we don't need to do that episode anymore, because that's it in a nutshell.
Well, we're going to talk about what it can be.
Yes. Yeah.
And give some ideas about how to be romantic. And again, I'm going to make a generalization. men typically have a harder time being romantic because
Yeah.
I think the reason is there's a strong emotional component involved in romance.
Yeah. All right. I hope everybody has a great Valentine's Day. Or if you don't like Valentine's Day, I hope you have just a great week and
Yep.
your Valentine's Day is like any other day.
Have a great week, everyone.
Bye, guys. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.